The courthouse in Tampa, Florida, had seen its share of drama over the years. From high-profile criminal trials to bitter family disputes, the walls had heard it all. But on that quiet Thursday morning, no one expected what was about to unfold. Pam Bondi stepped through the tall wooden doors with the kind of poise that came from years of courtroom experience. She carried her leather briefcase in one hand, the other gently adjusting the lapel of her navy blue blazer. Her gold cross necklace rested just above the neckline of her blouse, subtle, personal, and always there. It wasn't flashy, but it was hers. A reminder of her roots, her values, and the strength that had seen her through more than a few battles in her legal career. This hearing, at least on paper, was nothing special. A routine contract dispute between two small business owners. Pam could have argued it in her sleep, but as she made her way to the defendant's table, she could feel something off. It was the judge, Judge Warren Ellison. He was a man known across Florida's legal circles for his no-nonsense courtroom demeanor and sharp tongue. He ruled his court like a ship captain, firm, cold, and expecting full control. Pam had encountered judges like him before, but something about the way he looked at her sent a ripple through the air. He didn't look at her face, not at first. Instead, his eyes zeroed in on the small gold cross that hung just below her collarbone. Pam took her seat. She could feel the weight of his stare before he even opened his mouth. "Miss Bondi," Judge Ellison said, his tone clipped and formal, "I must remind you that religious symbols have no place in this courtroom." A hush fell over the room. The court clerk paused mid-note. The bailiff straightened slightly in his chair. Pam looked up, calm as ever. "Excuse me, Your Honor." The judge leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Your necklace. The cross. You'll need to remove it. It violates the neutrality of this courtroom. If you refuse, I'll have no choice but to fine you for disregarding the rules." For a moment, no one moved. Pam didn't blink. Her voice was steady. "With all due respect, Your Honor, you're wearing a wedding ring." The judge's eyes narrowed. "My cross is no different," she continued. "It's a personal item, like a locket or a photograph or a lapel pin." The tension in the courtroom rose like the Florida humidity outside. Pam had been in enough courtrooms to know when something bigger was taking shape. This wasn't about jewelry. It wasn't even about courtroom protocol. It was about power, and she wasn't going to let it go unchecked. Judge Ellison sat back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "You're testing the limits of courtroom decorum, Miss Bondi." Pam folded her hands neatly over her briefcase. "And you, Your Honor, are testing the limits of the Constitution." The air thickened. Even the court reporter paused, waiting for what would come next. This wasn't just a minor disagreement. It was a collision course between authority and principle, between a judge's rulebook and the First Amendment. And Pam Bondi wasn't the type to back down from either. Chapter 2. Pam remained perfectly still, her fingers calmly resting on the leather handle of her briefcase. The courtroom, usually filled with the rustling of papers and the low hum of legal chatter, had gone still. Even the ticking of the old clock above the judge's bench seemed louder now. Judge Ellison straightened in his seat, clearly expecting compliance. "Miss Bondi, the court does not need distractions. Remove the cross, or I will issue the fine." She inhaled slowly, then stood. "Your Honor," she said clearly, "before we proceed with any further matters, I respectfully request that this issue be addressed on the record." A few eyebrows raised, the court clerk glanced up from his notes. The court reporter leaned in slightly, fingers poised over the keyboard. Judge Ellison frowned. "We're not here to debate personal attire, Miss Bondi. This is a civil business dispute. Let's not derail the process." With Pam didn't flinch. "Your Honor, with respect, you've issued a financial penalty based on a visible religious symbol. That's not a matter of attire, it's a constitutional issue." Ellison's jaw tightened. "This courtroom is a neutral space. I enforce that neutrality equally." "Then with respect, sir," she said calmly, "I'll need you to cite the legal precedent you're relying on." A long pause followed. The request caught the judge off guard, and he clearly didn't appreciate being challenged, especially not so publicly. His fingers tapped against the bench once, then twice. "This courtroom operates under my authority," he said. Pam nodded, her expression respectful but unwavering. "That's true, but your authority is not above the Constitution. Under the First Amendment, personal religious expression is protected, so long as it does not disrupt the proceedings. And I think we can both agree a necklace is not a disruption." The judge's face darkened, but Pam wasn't finished. "If we're going to talk legality, let's talk about Tinker vs. Des Moines 1969, she said, reaching into her briefcase and removing a neatly folded sheet of paper. "The Supreme Court ruled that individuals do not shed their constitutional rights when entering government institutions, including schools. That principle extends to any public government setting, including this courtroom." She unfolded the document and held it in her hand. "I also refer to West Virginia State Board of Education vs. D. Barnett, 1943. In that case, the court held that compelling someone to suppress or hide a personal belief, or punishing them for expressing it, is a violation of their First Amendment rights." The courtroom was utterly still now. Even the bailiff looked frozen mid-breath. Judge Ellison leaned back slowly in his chair. "Miss Bondi, you are not here to teach law. You are here to represent a client." "I am here to do both," she replied, her voice steady. "And right now, I am representing the rights of every American who might be silenced or punished for living their faith in public." The judge's lips thinned. "This is not a religious trial." Pam took a measured step forward. "Then why, Your Honor, did you make it one?" A few quiet gasps rippled from the benches behind her. The court clerk dropped his pen. The judge's expression faltered just slightly. "I didn't initiate this confrontation," Pam continued. "I came here to argue a case. You chose to make my necklace an issue. So yes, I will respond, respectfully, but firmly." Judge Ellison's eyes flicked toward the clerk. "Mark the fine as pending review." Pam gave the faintest nod. "I appreciate that, Your Honor. But it wasn't over. Not by a long." She sat down, calm and collected, but the wheels in her mind were already turning. This fine, whether rescinded or not, was a line crossed. A message had been sent, and now she was determined to send one right back. She turned to her client, a middle-aged man in a grey suit who looked both shocked and deeply impressed. "We'll continue with your hearing," she whispered, "but this won't end here." As the proceedings resumed, the energy in the room had clearly shifted. People were no longer focused on the contract dispute. All eyes remained subtly on Pam. She had stood up, not just to a judge, but to something deeper. She had stood up to the idea that a courtroom could demand silence where faith was concerned. And in doing so she had lit a spark. What she didn't know yet, what she couldn't possibly predict, was how quickly that spark would turn into a fire. By the time the gavel finally came down and court was adjourned, word of what happened had already begun to trickle out. A local reporter covering an unrelated case had witnessed the exchange. She made a quick call to her editor before even leaving the building. And by the time Pam stepped out into the Florida sun, her phone buzzed, then buzzed again, then again. She looked down at the notifications, missed call texts, emails, and at the top of her screen, a headline already going live: Florida attorney fined for wearing a cross, but she didn't back down. Chapter 3. Judge Ellison tapped his pen against the bench, visibly trying to regain control. But control was slipping. Pam remained seated, her back straight, voice clear, and her gold cross still visible. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every word she spoke now cut with quiet authority. Your Honor, you claim that allowing one form of personal expression opens the door to all. But if that door is already open, why is it only now being shut in my direction? Ellison leaned forward, his tone defensive. This courtroom has a responsibility to maintain order and neutrality. Pam nodded slowly. Then perhaps you can explain why you've allowed other symbols of personal belief and affiliation in this very courtroom without objection. A murmur rippled through the observers seated in the gallery. Pam continued, her tone measured but firm. I've appeared in this courthouse more than a dozen times. I've seen defense attorneys wear pink breast cancer awareness ribbons. I've seen prosecutors wear American flag pins, judges with Masonic rings, and court staff with rosary bracelets tucked under their sleeves. None of those were considered violations of courtroom neutrality. She turned slightly in her chair and addressed the gallery, not to grandstand, but to remind everyone that they had seen it too. You've allowed wedding bands, memorial pins, cultural jewelry without challenge. But a cross? Suddenly that's too far. Judge Ellison's jaw tightened. Pam didn't back down. What exactly makes this cross different from a wedding ring? Both represent deep, personal commitment. Both symbolize identity and values. Or is it that this symbol reminds people of something more controversial in your eyes? Something you'd rather not see in a courtroom? She let that question hang in the air. The silence in the room wasn't just thick, it was charged. The judge exhaled sharply through his nose. I've told you this is not about religion. Pam tilted her head. But Your Honor, you are the one who made it about religion. You singled out my cross while remaining silent about other personal symbols that pass through this courtroom every day. That's not neutrality. That's selective enforcement. There was a quiet stir behind her, several people nodded. The court reporter's fingers worked quickly now, transcribing what was turning into a potential landmark exchange. Pam leaned forward slightly. If I may, Your Honor, it seems you are less concerned about courtroom order and more concerned about this particular expression of belief. Ellison shifted in his chair. His grip on the gavel tightened. Pam pressed on. I'd like to enter a formal objection into the record, not only to the fine itself, which you've now placed under review, but to the discriminatory nature of its issue. I believe your order reflects a personal bias rather than a legal standard. Objection noted, Ellison muttered, but his voice had lost some of its force. Pam gave a short nod. She knew when a point had landed, and this one had hit squarely. She sat back in her seat, hands folded once again over her briefcase. She didn't smile, she didn't gloat, but there was power in her silence, the kind that comes not from arrogance, but from principle. The judge cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable now. He shuffled the papers on his desk, as if the motion might restore a sense of normalcy. "Let's move on with the scheduled matter," he said briskly. "The court will now hear the arguments regarding the contract dispute between Mr. Gilbert and West Bay Holding." But no one in the room had truly moved on. They had witnessed something different that morning, something beyond legal motions and business disagreements. They had seen a lawyer stand her ground. They had seen her challenge the very person who held the gavel, and do it with dignity, precision, and faith. Pam turned toward her client. He looked stunned, not just by the judge, but by her. His brows raised, his lips slightly parted, but what stood out most was the admiration in his eyes. "Let's win your case now," she said gently. The rest of the hearing proceeded without further incident. The tension didn't disappear, but it transformed from confrontation to quiet respect. Even Judge Ellison, though still clipped in his delivery, kept his attention on the matter at hand. But by the time the final gavel fell, the real hearing had already taken place, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. As people filed out into the warm Tampa air, they whispered, they glanced at Pam, they nodded. A few came up and shook her hand. One woman, a paralegal, leaned in and said, "Thank you for not backing down." Pam simply replied, "It was never just about me," and it wasn't. What had begun as a routine hearing had become a turning point, a challenge, a statement. Pam walked down the courthouse steps slowly, aware that something had shifted. In the system, in the conversation, maybe even in the hearts of those who had witnessed what happened inside. She had defended her right to wear a cross. Yes, but more than that, she had defended the right of anyone to bring their beliefs into the public square without fear of being silenced for it. As the last words of the day's hearing echoed off the marble walls, Judge Ellison gavelled the session to a close. Most attorneys would have taken that as a sign to pack up and move on. But Pam Bondi wasn't like most attorneys. She remained seated, her eyes fixed squarely on the bench. Her client was already gathering his papers, unaware that the real fight was only beginning. Ellison adjusted his robe, clearly eager to put the confrontation behind him. But Pam calmly stood up, reached into a briefcase, and pulled out a folded document, a written objection. "Your Honor," she said firmly, "before I leave this courtroom, I'd like to make one final statement for the record." The judge, halfway to standing, froze. "We're adjourned, Miss Bondi. Then let this be said for the record before I step out that door." Ellison sighed, settling back into his chair with visible irritation. "Proceed." Pam looked around the courtroom, not dramatically, but deliberately. The bailiff clerk and the handful of remaining observers leaned in. "Today you fined me for wearing a cross," she began. "You claimed it was about neutrality. You later called it courtroom decorum. And now, you've walked it back under the excuse of a pending review. But let's be clear, this was not about a dress code. It was about silencing religious expression in a place where the Constitution still applied." Ellison's face remained unreadable, but his grip on the bench had tightened. Pam pressed on. "And if this fine isn't formally rescinded in writing, I will be filing an appeal before the ink dries. That appeal will cite constitutional law, prior Supreme Court rulings and the selective enforcement you yourself demonstrated today. She placed the objection on the clerk's desk. I will also be notifying the Florida Judicial Qualifications Commission and, if necessary, the Office of Civil Rights. This isn't a threat, Your Honor. It's a promise, not just for myself, but for every attorney, witness, juror, or citizen who steps into this courtroom and wonders if they have to hide their faith to be treated fairly. The room was so quiet, the hum of the overhead lights felt deafening. Ellison tried to maintain control. Bondi, are you finished? Not quite, she said. Because I want this on record too. I have no desire to escalate conflict for the sake of ego or spectacle. But I do have a duty to the law, to my clients, and to the First Amendment. You may hold the gavel, but you do not hold the final word on the Constitution. There it was, spoken plainly, without venom, but with unshakable resolve. The judge's eyes narrowed. Are you accusing this court of religious discrimination? Pam didn't flinch. I'm accusing this court of inconsistency, of selective enforcement, and of issuing a fine that cannot be defended under any legitimate constitutional standard. A long pause followed. Then finally Ellison exhaled, slowly, heavily. The fine, he muttered, is rescinded. He said it quietly, like a man biting his tongue. But in that moment, the power shifted. Pam gave a slight nod. Much appreciated, Your Honor. But this wasn't about gratitude. This was about precedent. She gathered her papers, nodded to her client, and made her way to the courtroom doors. But even as she stepped into the hallway, she could feel the weight of what had just happened pressing against her shoulders. She hadn't just won a legal skirmish. She had drawn a line. And now the whole courthouse knew it. Outside, the morning's humidity had broken. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the steps. A local reporter, who'd been covering a different hearing down the hall, caught sight of Pam and jogged over. I heard something went down in courtroom 3, he said, voice hushed but excited. Care to comment? Pam paused, considering. Then she said plainly, a judge tried to fine me for wearing a cross. I challenged him. He backed down. The reporter blinked. Seriously? Pam nodded. Seriously. 10 minutes later, her name was trending online. The headline on the local news site read, Florida judge tries to fine attorney over cross necklace. Backs down after challenge. Within an hour, the national blogs had picked it up. And with that, the real battle had begun. Pam returned to her office that evening to find her inbox full. Messages from colleagues, supporters, and even strangers. Some praised her for standing firm. Others warned her to let it go, to avoid poking the judicial bear. But she knew better. Judge Ellison had only rescinded the fine because he had no choice in the moment. That didn't mean he was finished. Men like him rarely walked away quietly from a challenge to their authority. Still, Pam wasn't afraid. She had faced down CEOs, prosecutors, and government officials. She wasn't about to back down now. Especially not when the issue cut this close to home. That night she drafted a formal motion, placing the entire incident into the public record. She didn't accuse the judge of misconduct yet, but she laid out every legal reference, every quote, every precedent he had tried to brush aside. Because she knew this wasn't just about her. It was about the next young attorney who might hesitate to wear her cross to court. The courtroom clerk who keeps a small Bible in her bag but hides it under papers. The Muslim woman who wonders if her headscarf would be seen as disruptive. The Jewish man with his yarmulke. The Sikh with his turban. The people who walk into a courtroom not to make a statement but simply to be themselves. Pam wouldn't let one judge turn the Constitution into a suggestion. She wouldn't let this become normal. And so as the media began to stir and the legal world started whispering, Pam sat at her desk reviewing case law late into the night, gold cross still gently glinting under her desk lamp. She hadn't started this battle, but she was sure going to finish it. Chapter 5. Pam had barely finished her evening coffee when her phone buzzed again. The notifications hadn't stopped since she left the courthouse, but this one was different. It was from Lisa Reynolds, a national legal correspondent she'd worked with in the past. Known for her sharp interviews and zero tolerance for judicial overreach, Lisa wasn't someone who called without reason. Pam answered. "Lisa, I just saw the clip," Lisa said without greeting. "Is it true?" Pam leaned back in her chair. "If you're talking about Judge Ellison trying to fine me over a cross, then yes, he tried. Then I pushed back, and he backed down. He rescinded the fine on record," Pam replied. "But that's not the end of it. Trust me." Lisa's voice lowered. "You planning to take this public?" Pam didn't even hesitate. "Already drafted the public motion. I want this on the record. Not just for me, but for every attorney who doesn't have a platform to fight back." There was a brief pause. Then Lisa said, "I want to cover it. On the air." Pam exhaled slowly. "I was hoping you'd say that." By the next morning, the story had exploded across social media. The headline that first ran on a small Florida news site had gone national. "Florida judge attempts to fine attorney for wearing a cross. Backs down after constitutional showdown." The reaction was immediate and fiery. On Twitter, hashtags like "Cross in Court," "First Amendment Fight," and "Stand with Pam" began trending. Facebook groups lit up with discussion threads, some praising Pam for standing firm, others debating the limits of religious expression in public institutions. On talk radio, callers from across the political spectrum weighed in. "She stood her ground and stood for all of us," said one caller from Georgia. "Judges don't get to rewrite the Constitution," added another from Ohio. But not everyone was supportive. Some voices, particularly from the more institutional corners of the legal world, warned against politicizing courtroom decorum. She should have just taken the necklace off and avoided the confrontation, one law professor said on a legal podcast, to which Lisa Reynolds responded, "Live on air. If silence is the price of fairness, it's not justice, it's surrender." Pam watched the debates unfold from her office, a steady stream of texts and emails filling her inbox. Many were from people she hadn't heard from in years. Law school classmates, old colleagues, former clients. A few sent scripture verses. Others simply wrote, "Thank you." She didn't reply to all of them. She couldn't. But she read every word. What struck her most were the quiet ones. A retired judge from Tennessee wrote, "I never allowed visible religious symbols in my court. After seeing what you did, I'm rethinking that. Maybe I was wrong." A young attorney in New York emailed, "I've always tucked my cross inside my blouse because I didn't want to rock the boat. Not anymore." Pam knew what was happening. This wasn't about a single courtroom anymore. This was about the culture of silence and subtle suppression rules, unwritten, but powerful. Rules that said, keep your faith quiet if you want to be taken serious. And she had shattered that rule in the middle of a Florida courtroom. But she also knew the backlash was coming. The Florida Bar Association released a carefully worded statement late Friday evening. While the judiciary has the responsibility to maintain order and decorum, attorneys retain constitutional protections of expression. We encourage respectful resolution of such matters within established professional channels. Pam read it twice. It was neutral on the surface, but she could read between the lines. It was a warning. The system didn't like being challenged, even when it was wrong. Still, she wasn't intimidated, because the court of public opinion was awake and watching. By Saturday morning, Pam received a call from the national Sunday news program. They wanted her on air to discuss faith, law, and freedom in the courtroom. She agreed on one condition. "I'm not going to attack Judge Ellison," she told the producer. "This isn't personal, it's principle. I'm not interested in revenge. I'm interested in making sure no judge does this again." The producer agreed. And when the segment aired Sunday morning, Pam didn't speak like a victim or a firebrand. She spoke like an attorney who knew her constitution and had the courage to invoke it, not just in books, but in the real world where it mattered. "I wore a cross to court because it's part of who I am," she said on air. "If a judge had asked me to remove my wedding ring, would that be acceptable? If he asked someone to cover up a Star of David or remove a hijab, would we be okay with that?" She paused, looking into the camera. "This isn't about one symbol. It's about a culture of quiet compromise, where people are told to hide what matters most to them. I didn't wear the cross to make a statement, but I challenged the fine because he made it a statement." By the time the segment ended, her message had resonated far beyond the legal world. Churches played the clip during services, civic groups held discussions, and most importantly, people began to speak up, not in anger, but in truth. Pam had touched something deep, not politics, not policy, but conviction. And while Judge Ellison may have hoped the issue would die quietly in a courtroom, he had badly underestimated the reach of one woman with courage and a gold cross that refused to be hidden. Chapter 6. By Monday morning, the storm had reached full strength. Pam's name was being discussed on news panels across the country. Her inbox was overflowing. Church groups, constitutional scholars, even veterans associations had reached out in support. Her stand had struck a chord, particularly with older Americans who remembered a time when faith wasn't something you had to apologize for. But just as momentum was swinging in her favor, the counterstrike came. Pam arrived at her office early, greeted by her assistant Lauren, whose face gave everything away before she even spoke. "You're going to want to see this," Lauren said, holding out her tablet. Pam took it, scrolling down the screen. Her heart didn't race, but her jaw tightened with every line. It was a statement from the Florida Bar Association, not about the constitutional rights she'd defended, but about her conduct. It was written in typical bureaucratic tone, careful, polished, and painfully precise. "While we do not comment on specific disciplinary matters unless they result in public action, we remind all attorneys that courtroom conduct must reflect professionalism, respect for judicial authority, and a commitment to orderly proceedings." Pam, "So, it begins." Lauren hesitated, then handed her a second document, this one printed, with a header she recognized immediately. It was a formal complaint, filed against her. Pam scanned the page. Attorney Pamela Bondi conducted herself in a manner that disrupted courtroom proceedings, challenged judicial authority inappropriately, and engaged in behavior unbecoming of an officer of the court. Pam let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Unbecoming? That's rich." She dropped the document on her desk. Lauren sat down cautiously. You think it was Ellison? Pam nodded. No doubt about it. He's trying to reframe the narrative. I called out his abuse of power, and now he's spinning it to make me look like I'm the problem. It was a tactic as old as politics itself. Flip the script, make the accuser the accused. Take a moral stand, then punish them for not using the proper channels. Pam had seen this before, but never aimed at her. What's the response process? She asked. Lauren opened her notebook. You've got 10 days to file a formal answer. If the complaint proceeds, it could go to a review panel. Judges and senior attorneys, people he's probably already whispered to. Pam stood and walked to the window, arms folded. The city below was just waking up, but she could already feel the weight of the machine pressing down. This isn't just a warning, she said quietly. This is the beginning of a push to discredit me before this gets any bigger. He knows the media's watching. He's hoping to shift the conversation, make it about my behavior, not his. Lauren nodded. So what do we do? Pam turned back. Her eyes were clear. We take it public. Again. Are you sure? I'm sure, Pam said, because if he's doing this to me, someone with a voice and a platform, imagine what he's done to attorneys who couldn't speak up, who were silenced, intimidated, bullied. Lauren hesitated. But won't this just escalate it further? Pam gave a firm nod. It's already escalated. I didn't start this, but I won't let it be buried. She grabbed her phone, scrolling until she found the contact she needed. Lisa Reynolds, again. Lisa answered before the second ring. Pam, I heard. He's filed a complaint, Pam said. He's trying to turn this into a disciplinary matter. Says I disrupted the courtroom. Lisa didn't miss a beat. Do you want to respond on the record? Pam nodded. Yes, but not just that. I want the public to know what's happening, because this isn't about a necklace, it's about precedent. If this becomes the new normal, judges issuing fines, then punishing pushback, we're going to see freedom shrink inside courtrooms faster than anyone realizes. Lisa's voice lowered. You know I've got your back. Give me an hour. I'll have a producer reach out. We'll do it right. After hanging up, Pam turned back to Lauren. I want a statement drafted by noon. We're not responding with anger. We're responding with facts. Lauren clicked her pen. Framing? Pam didn't hesitate. Judicial overreach, weaponizing the system, retaliation against protected speech, and more importantly, what this means for every person who walks into a courtroom thinking the Constitution still applies. Lauren was already typing. Pam sat down again, pulling the formal complaint closer. She read it again, this time slowly. She recognized the language. It was stiff, generic, intentionally vague, but behind every sentence, she could hear Ellison's voice. He wasn't just protecting himself. He was trying to make an example out of her, show others what happens when you embarrass a judge. But Ellison had made a critical miscalculation. He had underestimated who she was. Pam Bondi didn't just know the law, she knew how to use it. She knew how to speak plainly to people who had grown tired of being told their values didn't belong in public. She knew how to fight on paper and on camera. And more than anything, she knew how to stand alone when it counted. So while Ellison may have filed his complaint quietly, hoping it would scare her into silence, he just triggered the very thing he feared most. Pam wasn't going to retreat. She was going to go louder. Chapter 7. Pam didn't wait. She knew how systems worked, how quietly they moved when no one was looking, and how quickly they folded when light was shown on the right spot. As soon as she hung up with Lisa Reynolds, Her next call was to her media consultant. By noon, Pam's public statement was drafted, edited, and published across every platform she had. A judge tried to silence me with a fine for wearing a cross. When I stood my ground, he backed down, only to file a formal complaint, accusing me of being unprofessional for defending my rights. This is not about a necklace. This is about judicial overreach. And I refuse to be intimidated behind closed doors. The message was short, direct, and powerful. Within an hour, thousands had shared it. Lisa Reynolds released a teaser clip of her upcoming exposé on her legal affairs segment. The caption read, "Coming tomorrow, did a Florida judge weaponize his authority to silence faith in the courtroom?" Attorney Pam Bondi speaks out. But Lisa didn't stop there. Pam had given her more than just sound bites. She had given her documents. Court transcripts, audio from the hearing, the written complaint filed by Judge Ellison, and a list of previous courtroom incidents that showed a pattern of selective enforcement. Lisa's team got to work. They started digging, and what they found was even more damning than Pam expected. Judge Ellison, in past rulings, had allowed attorneys to wear breast cancer awareness pins, American flag ties, military lapel pins, and even cultural jewelry, without ever once referencing courtroom neutrality. But now, with a cross, that was suddenly too far. By the end of the day, Lisa called Pam directly. "Pam," she said, her voice calm but charged, "this isn't just retaliation. This is personal." "I know," Pam said. "I've spoken to 2 attorneys off record who said Ellison's been known to warn lawyers about displaying too much religion in court." Lisa added, "But no one wanted to come forward until now." Pam paused. "Can they go on the record?" One already agreed, the others considering. "Perfect," Pam said. "Then let's go public." Fully. Lisa's special segment aired the next evening. It opened with footage of the courtroom. A voiceover explained the exchange, a seasoned attorney being fined by a judge, not for misconduct, but for wearing a cross. Then the camera cut to Pam, seated in her office, poised, composed. "I didn't go into court looking for a fight," she said. "I went in to do my job. But when a judge decides your faith doesn't belong in his courtroom, you have a choice: stay silent or speak up." The next segment showed legal experts weighing in, one from a conservative think tank, another from a secular law center, both agreeing on the same point: what happened to Pam was unconstitutional. Then came the bombshell. Lisa presented the complaint Ellison had filed against Pam, and then overlaid it with clips of his past court decisions, where religious or symbolic displays were allowed without objection. The conclusion was clear: Judge Ellison wasn't upholding courtroom neutrality. He was targeting. By the time the credits rolled, social media had exploded again. News outlets on both sides of the aisle picked up the story. Headlines read, "Florida attorney fights back against religious discrimination in court. Judge under fire for retaliating after losing legal showdown." The tides began to shift. By morning, she had interviews lined up with 3 major national news outlets. Radio hosts were quoting her. Faith-based organizations and civil liberties groups released statements of support. Even a few prominent judges, retired but still respected, began commenting anonymously, calling Ellison's complaint deeply troubling. But most importantly, something else happened. A second attorney, this one from another county in Florida, went on the record. She admitted that years ago she too had been cautioned by Judge Ellison for wearing her faith too openly in court. She'd been told to keep her cross under her collar next time. I didn't want to risk my career, the woman told Lisa's team, so I never spoke up. But after what Pam did, I realized I should have. Pam watched that interview twice, not because it shocked her, but because it validated everything she already knew. This wasn't about one moment. It was about a pattern. It was about fear. And now, people weren't afraid anymore. Back in her office, Lauren walked in with a fresh report from their media monitoring team. "You're trending on every major platform," she said. "But more than that, people are mobilizing. There's already a petition with 20,000 signatures calling for a formal review of Judge Ellison's conduct." Pam nodded. "Steady. Good. Let the public in. Let them see exactly what happens when power is used to suppress freedom." Lauren hesitated. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Pam gave a small smile. "I've been ready since the moment he looked at my cross and saw a threat. Because what Judge Ellison didn't understand was this. Pam Bondi hadn't stood her ground to win a courtroom moment. She had done it so that no one, no attorney, no citizen, no child watching from home would believe that their faith had to be hidden in exchange for justice. And now the whole country was watching, and the real reckoning was just beginning. Chapter 8. By midweek, the ripple had become a wave. What began as a courtroom confrontation had turned into a national reckoning. Pam Bondi's face appeared not just on news channels, but on podcast thumbnails, magazine covers, and even church bulletin boards. In coffee shops, barber shops, and retirement homes across the country, people weren't just talking about her, they were talking about what she stood for. Across all age groups, the story stirred something deep, but for older Americans especially, it hit home. Many of them remembered a time when you didn't have to explain your faith, apologize for it, or hide it to be polite. They remembered courtroom Bibles, morning prayers in school, and crosses worn openly without controversy. For them, this wasn't just about Pam. It was about a country they feared was forgetting what mattered. Phone calls poured into Pam's office from across the states. A World War II veteran from Pennsylvania left a message. "I didn't fight halfway across the world just so a judge could find someone for wearing a cross. Tell her I said thank you." A former school teacher from Mississippi wrote, "I kept quiet when I was told not to wear my tiny cross pendant in the classroom. I wish I had been braver then, but Pam reminded me, it's never too late to speak up." And then came the scholars. A respected law professor at Georgetown published an op-ed titled, "Pam Bondi, the Constitution and the Price of Speaking Boldly." In it he wrote, "Regardless of political affiliation, the First Amendment is not up for negotiation." What happened in that Florida courtroom was more than judicial overreach. It was a challenge to one of the most sacred principles of our democracy, that personal conviction should never be penalized in public space. Meanwhile, organizations that rarely agreed on anything found themselves on the same page. Civil liberties groups, religious freedom advocates, conservative think tanks, and even moderate legal watchdogs released joint statements urging the Florida Judicial Review Board to take Pam's complaint seriously and to investigate Judge Ellison's pattern of rulings. But what truly surprised Pam were the quiet acknowledgments from within the legal system itself. Late one night she received a handwritten letter mailed, not emailed, from a retired judge in Oregon. "Dear Ms. Bondi, I served on the bench for 20 years. I believed in rules, structure, and decorum. But I also believed in fairness. Watching your courage in court reminded me why I joined the judiciary in the first place. Don't let them twist your conviction into misconduct. You carried the Constitution into that courtroom with you, and you carried it well. Pam held the letter in her hands long after she read it. For all the press appearances, legal debates, and online commentary, it was letters like this, simple, personal, sincere, that kept her centered. She hadn't set out to become a symbol, but now that she was, she knew the responsibility that came with it. Across social media, the hashtag #JanStandWithPam continued to trend, but a new one had started gaining traction. Faith is not unprofessional. Law students began posting photos of themselves wearing crosses, stars of David, headscarves, and other religious symbols with the caption, "If Pam can wear hers in court, I can wear mine in class." Pam's own alma mater invited her to speak at their next legal ethics symposium. The email read, "We believe your experience offers an invaluable lesson on integrity, professional courage, and the real-world challenges of defending civil liberties, and perhaps most stunning of all, during a live primetime interview, a sitting senator from Ohio, unaffiliated with Pam politically, was asked about the case. His response, 'I may not agree with Ms. Bondi on everything, but what she did took gut. And let's be honest, if the First Amendment doesn't protect a quiet piece of jewelry in a courtroom, what does it protect?'" The crowd applauded. Pam watched the clip in silence from her office. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply took a breath, because she knew how fragile public attention could be. Today's news cycle could be tomorrow's footnote. But if she played this right, if she stayed focused, this case could become more than a viral moment. It could become a precedent. That evening, her assistant Lauren walked in with a new stack of messages. "You're booked solid through next week," she said. CBS, Fox, NPR, even a faith-based network that broadcasts to senior communities. They all want to talk to you. Pam nodded. "Good. I'm not done talking." Lauren sat across from her. "You've changed something, you know." Pam raised an eyebrow. "How do you mean?" Lauren held up her phone and scrolled through a comment section on a local news site. "I'm not religious, but I respect her fight. I used to think faith had no place in law. Now I think maybe we've gone too far the other way. I'm a young atheist, and I still believe what that judge did was wrong. Rights belong to everyone, or they belong to no one." Pam leaned back in her chair. That was it. That was the heart of it. This wasn't about winning over one side. It wasn't about stirring outrage. It was about reminding people where the line is, and what happens when someone in power crosses it. She stood, adjusted her blazer, and looked at the gold cross still resting just beneath her collarbone. Judge Ellison may have tried to make her hide it, but now it had become a symbol for thousands, and that, she realized, was something even a gavel couldn't silence. Chapter 9. The email landed just after sunrise. Pam sat at her kitchen table, coffee in hand, watching the sun climb slowly over the Tampa skyline. The night had been long, filled with messages, interviews, and more public statements to draft than she could count. She hadn't expected peace, but she had hoped for a moment of stillness. Instead, her inbox pinged. It was from the Florida Judicial Review Board. Subject, notification of preliminary inquiry. Judge Harold Ellison. Pam clicked it open, her eyes scanning quickly. Due to the substantial public attention and the serious nature of the concerns raised, the Judicial Review Board has voted to initiate a formal inquiry into the conduct of Judge Harold Ellison related to the courtroom incident involving attorney Pamela Bondi. This review will consider whether judicial ethics were breached, and if the judge's actions demonstrated bias, selective enforcement, or retaliation. She didn't blink, she didn't smile, but she felt it. The shift. This wasn't a personal feud anymore. This was official, and it was happening because she refused to back down. 10 minutes later, she was in the office. Lauren was already there, coffee ready and phone in hand. "You saw it?" she asked. Pam nodded. "Just now?" Lauren smiled. "We did it." Pam shook her head. "Not yet, but we're finally in the right room." The announcement hit the press an hour later. News outlets updated their headlines. Judicial Review Board opens investigation into Florida. Judge who fined lawyer for wearing cross. Pam Bondi's case triggers ethics inquiry. Legal community watches closely. Social media exploded again. Hashtags like Jane Ellison under review and judicial accountability now began trending. What surprised Pam most wasn't the attention, it was who started talking. Lawyers, judges, clerks, bailiffs, people who had stayed quiet for years began to speak out. Some submitted statements to the board anonymously. Others reached out to Lisa Reynolds' team directly. One attorney emailed, "I once had a client who wanted to carry a small Bible during trial. Judge Ellison told me in chambers to handle it, that it was inappropriate in his courtroom. I told the client not to bring it back. I've regretted it since." Watching Pam push back reminded me of that moment. Another wrote, "I wore a Star of David pendant into court once. Ellison pulled me aside and asked if I thought it was wise to wear religious symbols while arguing in front of a jury. He didn't ban it. He just warned me. That's how he operates. Always behind closed doors." It wasn't just about Pam anymore. It never had been. Her story had become a spotlight, and in that light, dozens of hidden patterns were starting to appear. The review board's inquiry meant interviews, document reviews, and the possibility, however remote, of disciplinary action. For a sitting judge, it was serious. For the legal system, it was unprecedented. And for the people watching at home, especially those who had followed every development, it was a moment of reckoning. Even long-time legal analysts, often cautious to weigh in on judicial matters, were acknowledging the weight of the investigation. On a national legal panel, one commentator said, "It's not just about whether Judge Ellison overstepped. It's about whether the public still believes the courtroom is a place where the Constitution is respected, without exception." Pam watched that segment with quiet focus. She wasn't celebrating. She was preparing. Because if there was one thing she'd learned in her years practicing law, it was this: public pressure opens the door, but facts walk it through. Back in her office, she started compiling everything: transcripts, emails, eyewitness statements, relevant case law, prior complaints against Ellison, some informal, some never followed through. Her response to the Florida bar's complaint was already written and filed. Now her attention shifted fully to the review board's process. She wasn't just defending herself anymore, she was building a case. Not for vengeance, for clarity, for accountability. For every single person who had ever stood in front of a judge and wondered if their beliefs would cost them justice. At the end of the week, Pam sat for a second televised interview. This time the interviewer didn't open with questions about the cross or the complaint. He asked, "Pam, when this started, did you imagine it would get this far?" She thought about it for a moment. "No," she admitted, "but I hoped it would." The interviewer leaned in. "Why?" Pam looked straight at the camera. "Because we've all gotten too used to backing down," she said. "We tell ourselves it's not worth the fight, that maybe it's just better to stay quiet. But silence doesn't protect rights. It erodes them. She continued, "The law doesn't mean anything if it can be ignored behind a robe. It doesn't mean anything if we allow fear to rewrite what freedom looks like." There was a pause, then applause from the small studio audience, and on screens across the country, living rooms, waiting rooms, break rooms, people listened. Some nodded, some cried, and some, for the first time in years, remembered what it felt like to believe the system could still work if enough people refused to be quiet. Chapter 10. Judge Harold Ellison stood behind the podium outside the courthouse, flanked by 2 aides and a scattering of reporters. Cameras clicked, microphones extended, and the Florida sun bore down with quiet intensity. His face, once a mask of confidence and control, now showed something different: tension. His voice was steady but lacked the commanding tone that had once silenced entire courtrooms. "I have always upheld the integrity of this courtroom," he began, reading from a statement. "The actions taken were in the interest of maintaining neutrality. However, I respect the judicial review process and will cooperate fully. No apologies, no retractions, just a tightly worded effort to save face." But no one was buying it. The clip aired across national news outlets within the hour, and the reaction was swift. "This isn't Anne taking accountability," one legal analyst said on live TV. "It's a man trying to hold on to his bench while the ground is disappearing beneath him." Online, public sentiment had shifted fully. While a few defenders still clung to the idea of courtroom decorum, the majority now saw Ellison for what he had become: a symbol of judicial overreach, a cautionary tale. Attorneys began whispering in the hallways of courthouses across Florida, "That's Ellison, the one who went after Bondi and lost. Careful in his courtroom if he's even still on the bench." His colleagues, the ones who once nodded to him with respect in judicial conferences, were now avoiding eye contact. Some privately questioned his judgment. Others outright condemned his actions. A sitting judge from Jacksonville publicly stated, "The courtroom is not a vacuum. If a judge cannot distinguish between neutrality and suppression, then perhaps he is not fit to wear the robe." It was unprecedented. Rarely did members of the judiciary speak openly about one of their own, but Ellison had crossed a line that couldn't be hidden behind legal jargon or procedural smokescreens. Pam watched the fallout unfold from her office, her expression unreadable. She didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate. She just worked, because she understood something Judge Ellison never did. You don't earn authority by silencing people, you earn it by protecting their rights, even when you disagree with them. Lauren entered with a report in hand. "You'll want to see this." Pam looked up. Internal surveys from the Florida bar show that over 70% of responding attorneys now support clearer protections for religious expression in court. "Because of your case," Lauren said. Pam nodded slowly. "That's what we needed. Not just noise change." But the most telling sign that Ellison's legacy had crumbled came not from statements or headlines, but from the courtroom itself. The next time Pam appeared before a judge in a different district, a different case, the atmosphere had changed. The judge, a seasoned jurist known for his attention to protocol, opened with a quiet but pointed remark. "Ms. Arandi, you're welcome in my courtroom, and your necklace is not a disruption." A few attorneys in the room smiled. Pam gave a small nod. No speech, no reaction, just a quiet acknowledgement that the message had been received. Later that day, a young intern approached her outside the courthouse. "I'm starting law school next year," he said. "My mom and I watched your interview last week," she said. That woman is what a lawyer is supposed to be. Pam thanked him, shook his hand, and walked on, but the words lingered. What started as one moment of resistance had become a cultural flashpoint, and now it was shaping how the next generation viewed the law, not as a rigid set of rules, but as a living promise. And Judge Ellison, he remained on the bench for now, but his courtroom was never the same. The quiet authority he once wielded now felt forced. Attorneys entered with guarded eyes. Clerks second-guessed instructions. Every decision he issued was watched, dissected, filed for review. A new nickname circulated behind closed doors. The gavel that missed. He heard it. Of course he did. He could feel the chill in the halls. He could see the hesitation in the faces of his peers. He knew he had become a liability to the institution he once embodied. The irony was painful. In trying to silence one woman's faith, he had exposed the fragility of his own power. And for Pam, the story wasn't over, but the message had been delivered. You don't have to raise your voice to make a stand. You don't have to break the rules to break through injustice. You just have to stand firmly, faithfully, and without fear. Chapter 11. The buzz was starting to fade. The headlines grew smaller, the interviews less frequent. Pam Bondi had done what few in her profession ever managed. She'd walked into a courtroom as an attorney and walked out a symbol. But as the national attention began to shift to the next hot-button issue, Pam stayed rooted in what mattered. The work. One Thursday afternoon, weeks after the formal investigation into Judge Ellison had begun, Pam found herself back at her desk, sorting through a new batch of letters and emails. They no longer came in waves, but they still arrived every day. Quiet ripples from people across the country who had been touched by what happened. One stood out. It was from a woman in rural Indiana, handwritten in neat cursive on lined paper. Dear Ms. Bondi, I've been a public school teacher for 38 years. I've seen a lot change. Some good, some painful. Years ago, I stopped wearing my cross in the classroom. No one told me to. I just got tired of the looks. But after watching what you did, I started wearing it again. It's not about proving a point. It's just about not being ashamed. Thank you. Pam sat with the letter in her lap for a long time. It was moments like this, away from the cameras, the courtrooms, the political noise, that reminded her what the fight had really been about. It wasn't about a necklace. It wasn't about Judge Ellison. It was about dignity. About reminding people, quiet, everyday people, that they didn't need to shrink who they were to fit into public life. That same week, she spoke at a small legal seminar held by a state university. The auditorium wasn't packed. Maybe 60 people in all, mostly law students and a few professors. But Pam felt the weight of the moment more than any national interview she'd done. One student raised his hand and asked, "Do you feel like you won?" Pam smiled, pausing before answering. "You know," she said, "when Judge Ellison rescinded that fine, I thought that was the win. Then, when the investigation was opened, I thought that was the win. But honestly, the real victory came later. In the emails, the phone calls, the quiet moments when people told me they stopped hiding their faith or started standing up for someone else's." She looked out at the room, mostly young faces, most of them preparing to enter the very system she had just rattled. This wasn't just a courtroom moment, she continued. It was a reminder that the law isn't some cold structure. It's alive, and when it drifts off course, it's our job to pull it back. A few students nodded. One took notes furiously. Pam thought of how easy it would have been to walk away that day in court, pay the fine, keep her head down, move on. But if she had, the system would have stayed exactly the same. And now, even if the headlines faded, the foundation had shifted. Local bar associations were beginning to draft clearer language around personal religious expression in the courtroom. Judges were undergoing refresher courses on constitutional rights and implicit bias, and law schools were using her case as a teaching tool, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Pam left the university that day feeling something she hadn't in a long time. Not triumph, but peace. Later that evening, as she reviewed her calendar, she saw a new request in her inbox. It wasn't from a journalist or conference planner. It was from a small church in southern Georgia. The message was simple: we hold monthly legal clinics for veterans and the elderly. A lot of our people have lost faith in the justice system. We were wondering, would you come speak? Not as a lawyer, just as someone who stood up when it mattered. Pam stared at the screen for a long moment, then typed a response. Yes, I'd be honored, because that's what this had become. Not a legal skirmish, not a personal battle, but a living testimony that one person, standing firmly in truth, could inspire thousands more to stand alongside them. In the months that followed, Pam continued her work defending clients, mentoring young attorneys, attending town halls, but wherever she went, someone always mentioned the cross, not in reverence, in recognition. You're the one who didn't back down, they'd say, and she'd simply nod. Not because she needed the attention, but because each time someone remembered, it meant the message hadn't been lost. It meant courage had taken root, and it meant the next time someone faced a courtroom, a classroom, or a conference room, where they were told to set aside their faith, they might remember a woman named Pam Bondi, who wore a cross, stood her ground, and reminded the nation what freedom really looks like. Chapter 12: The End. The courthouse steps were quiet now. No cameras, no protesters, no press conferences, just the sound of wind brushing through the palms that lined the front lawn and the soft hum of traffic in downtown Tampa. Pam Bondi stood alone for a moment, her heels planted on the same concrete where this all began. She looked up at the stone columns, the building that once threatened to make her feel small. But today, she wasn't small. Not here. Not anymore. Inside, the official word had finally arrived. The Judicial Review Board had closed its investigation into Judge Harold Ellison. Their statement was concise, almost sterile in tone. But the message was clear. The board has found that Judge Ellison's actions during the incident involving attorney Pamela Bondi were inconsistent with judicial decorum and reflected a lapse in impartiality. While no formal sanctions will be issued, this matter has highlighted the need for renewed training in constitutional rights and courtroom conduct. No suspension, no disbarment, no public apology. Pam hadn't expected one. But that didn't matter, because the real victory had already happened. It was in the conversations that sparked across the country. It was in the churches that preached courage from the pulpit after her story. It was in the law schools rewriting syllabi to include her case. It was in the judges who now thought twice before drawing a line between professionalism and personal conviction. And it was in the thousands of people, especially seniors, veterans, teachers, and faith leaders, who wrote her letters to say, "Because of you, I remembered I have a voice." Pam stepped away from the steps, gold cross resting just below her collarbone, glinting in the afternoon sun. She wasn't angry about the board's decision. She wasn't disappointed either, because she hadn't fought for retribution. She fought for recognition. That faith is not a threat. That dignity doesn't end at the courthouse door. That you shouldn't have to choose between standing for your beliefs and standing for justice. Later that week, she spoke at a small community center in Tallahassee. No cameras, no press, just folding chairs, coffee urns, and about 50 people who wanted to hear from the woman with the cross. She stood behind a wooden podium, looked around the room and began quietly. "I didn't set out to start a movement," she said. "I didn't want a headline. I just didn't want to be told that a part of who I am had no place in the work I love." She paused, her voice calm and clear. "But I've learned something through all of this. Something simple but powerful. Sometimes the line between freedom and fear is a person who refuses to sit down." A few nods, a few misty eyes. Pam continued. "And that person doesn't have to be loud, doesn't have to be famous, doesn't have to win every argument. They just have to stand." Applause broke out, gentle at first, then growing sincere. Afterward, an elderly woman approached her, maybe in her 80s, with white curls and a soft southern drawl. She took Pam's hand and said, "Honey, I wore my cross to church every Sunday for 70 years, but I never thought I'd need courage to wear it in a courtroom. You gave that back to us." Pam held the woman's hand a moment longer, then smiled. "No, ma'am," she said. "You always had it. I just reminded you." That night, back home, Pam sat on her porch with a cup of coffee, watching the stars blink one by one across the Florida sky. The chaos had quieted, the storm had passed, but the impact remained. Her phone vibrated. Another message. A woman from California, agnostic by her own words, wrote, "I don't share your faith, but your strength made me question why I've been so afraid to speak up for what I do believe in. Thank you for being bold, not just for Christians, but for all of us." Pam looked up at the stars again. That was the point, wasn't it? This wasn't a Christian fight, or a conservative fight, or a political one. It was a human one. The right to be, to believe, to speak, to show up fully and freely in public life without shame or silence. She hadn't just defended her cross. She defended the principle that no government robe, no gavel, no fine could separate people from their dignity. And that realization, one forged in a courtroom confrontation, had lit a fire across the nation. A fire that would outlast headlines, that would shape conversations, that would make the next person who faced unfair pressure in a courtroom say, "I know my rights, I know my worth, and I'm not backing down." Pam didn't need another camera. She didn't need another speech. She just needed people to remember, because sometimes all it takes is one person, with quiet courage, to remind the world what liberty truly looks like. If you believe in standing up for your values, even when it's hard, remember this: change doesn't always come in crowds. Sometimes it starts with one voice, one act, one cross, and sometimes that's enough to shift everything. Standing firm in faith. A message for today's America. In today's fast-moving world where values seem to shift with the tides of opinion, the story of Pam Bondi reminds us that some things are still worth standing for, quietly, firmly, and without apology. Her courtroom challenge over a simple gold cross became more than just a legal moment. It became a reminder of who we are, what we believe, and why those beliefs still matter. For many of us who've lived long enough to see the country change in ways both hopeful and troubling, Pam's story struck a chord. We remember a time when faith wasn't something you had to defend, when symbols like a cross or a prayer weren't controversial. But today, the pressure to stay silent, to keep our beliefs hidden or watered down, has become all too real. And yet, what Pam showed us is that dignity doesn't come from blending in. It comes from standing firm. Her strength wasn't loud or angry. She didn't make threats or throw punches. She simply knew her rights, honored her faith, and refused to shrink to fit someone else's idea of neutrality. That kind of courage is rare, but it's also contagious. There's a lesson here for all of us, especially those of us in our golden years. We may no longer march in protests or argue cases in court, but our voices still carry weight. Our stories still matter. And perhaps more than ever, our quiet example of integrity, faith, and resilience can light the way for the next generation. Pam's journey reminded the nation that freedom of religion isn't just written on paper. It lives in how we show up every day, in courtrooms, in classrooms, in conversations at the coffee shop. And every time we choose not to hide what we believe, we breathe life back into the rights others have fought to protect. So whether you wear a cross, a Star of David, a service pin, or simply carry strong values in your heart, remember this: you don't need a spotlight to make a difference. You just need conviction. Pam didn't expect to change the conversation in America, but she did, because she chose to stand, even when it would have been easier to sit down. Let this be a reminder: it's never too late to be bold, never too late to speak truth with grace, never too late to protect what matters. The world may change, but courage, that never goes out of style,